Hello, I'm Ed Ludwig, speaking on behalf of the Doylestown Historical Society. And this is the third historical interview on Doylestown, its persons, places, and events. Our first was W. Lester Trout on his long career as a reporter with the Doylestown Intelligencer and his recollections of literary and theatrical celebrities who came to this area starting in the 1930s. Next was Herman Silverman on his 50-year friendship with Jim Michener. And this third interview is of Dorothy Hayman Redfield on Doylestown since the early 1900s as interviewed by Victoria Azar. And special thanks to Jim Bunn of Suburban Community Television, who is doing this filming. The last systematic history of Doylestown was done by W.H. Davis in a charming and detailed book called Doylestown Old and New. It ended in the year 1900. So we're fortunate to be able to do this interview of Dorothy Hayman Redfield, who lived in Doylestown for most of this century. And I think you'll agree, she's a historian in her own right. She's put in a prodigious amount of time and effort in assembling the materials for this interview. So now let's watch Doylestown since the early 1900s, Dorothy Hayman Redfield, interviewed by Vicky Azar.
Dorothy, we are so delighted that you agreed to do this interview. And your apartment is just filled with wonderful, wonderful memorabilia and a wonderful collection of paintings by your father-in-law, I believe, Edward Redfield. You called him Pops?
Pop.
Pop Redfield. Tell me a little bit about him.
Well, he was a wonderful painter and an unusually astute businessman. The combination doesn't often go together. He gave all of his 5 children things over the years amounting to a great deal of money, so that it would save on inheritance taxes.
Mm-hmm. You told me that he burned a number of paintings.
They tell us he burned 2,000. I seriously doubt that. But he did burn a number that he felt were not his best work. And I feel it takes a very, very big man to burn something for which he could get money to protect the value of things for which he's already been paid.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You've given us a wonderful collection of stories and recollections of the past century, your life here in Doylestown. Before we get into that, though, I'd like to take a couple of minutes and just look at some of these wonderful paintings here in your apartment by your father-in-law. This particular series on the wall behind you is, I think, would be of interest to the viewers. There are a series of paintings on covered bridge, Center Bridge.
Yes, Center Bridge.
And the first one on the left
shows Center Bridge in the background. Mm-hmm. And it went from Stockton to Center Bridge. And it burned in 1923. This is the burning. And then the one over there is the bridge that replaced it.
It was rebuilt. So your father-in-law was there the night it burned?
I was with him.
You were there?
Yes, it was before we were married.
Mm-hmm.
But I happened to be with him.
Now, Dorothy, let's talk about you. First of all, I want to thank you for all the time and energy and preparation you put into this. You've given us a wonderful autobiography and details about Doylestown, really enough, I think, to write a book. It's just been wonderful. You told me that you were born in 1901 in Wayne Junction? And then you came to Doylestown to live when?
In 1910.
Mm-hmm. And your family moved here. Your father was a physician. Tell me a little bit about your family, your brothers and sisters. You had...
I had 2 brothers and 1 sister.
Mm-hmm. And your father was an osteopath?
Yes, well.
Okay. Where did your family live?
Well, my father was an osteopathic physician, and he had an office on West Oakland Avenue for many years. And the last few years before we moved to Doylestown, he had the whole family board there, and he had 4 outstanding towns in which he had offices, and he divided them into half days and went there a half a day, twice a week.
And how did he get to those offices?
He used public transportation if it were available. Otherwise, he hired a horse and buggy. And livery stables were big business in those days.
Where was your first home in Doylestown?
We moved from Philadelphia to 148 East State Street, the present home of the Vista Agency.
Vista Travel. Mm-hmm.
Vista Travel.
That's a beautiful home.
And that property extended 1 block back to Oakland Avenue, and at that time sold for $6,000.
Gosh. And then he went on to buy the property across the street, the home at 153 East State?
Well, yes, he stayed at 148 until he had bought a car that made his traveling easier, and I frequently went with him in the summer on those trips. And then in 1915, he bought the 3-acre magnificent grounds of Lewis Buckman. And it had the paneling around the porch of the wrought iron. It had enormous boxwood hedges that led up to the house, and there was a widow's walk on the roof. And
must have been beautiful.
It was lovely.
And that was later, that in the 1950s, that was purchased and developed and split up, and it's now the Bucks County Bar Association, that location.
Just the stable. The house was completely torn down by then.
And the house actually became his private hospital, is that right?
That's right. In about 1930, the children all had homes of their own, and he made our home into a private hospital. He had 12 beds and 10 nurses, and only 1 nurse was necessary at night because the patients were all ambulatory. And he and Mother had their living quarters on the first floor, and the second floor was devoted entirely to the hospital and operating room.
And you worked there, you told me?
I administrated the hospital, and I had a private nurse's license. Not a private, I'm sorry, a practical.
So you worked there from 1930 till it closed in 1956?
That's right.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that your father traveled quite a bit. He went to conventions, and you often accompanied him. That was...
Well, I wanted to say, too, that he was so dedicated to his work that we saw little of him as a family man, although we did have 3 meals together every day, and my father always said a blessing before the meal. And my mother, who was very frail, had all the work of raising the children. And she was deeply religious and gave us all the high principles by which she lived, and taught us that there were always two sides to every situation.
Okay. And he traveled quite a bit? You went to conventions with him?
He never missed a convention that was connected with his work, and he never missed a Rotary convention. He had 30 years of perfect attendance at Rotary, and I even, aside from seeing a great deal of the country, got as far as Hawaii, which
What an opportunity.
it was a wonderful experience, but it wasn't all relaxation, because he was constantly having me make notes of something that he thought might improve his little hospital. And I want to say at this point that my husband was very, very happy to have me have the opportunity of traveling. And when I got home from a trip, he always had done something to improve our remodeled barn, which was our home. He had painted a room or added a patio or something that he knew would please me. And we had all of our meals at the hospital. And when our daughter was old enough to go to school, there was no problem, because the hospital grounds adjoined the school grounds, except for the separation of a little alley.
Oh, so she could walk right over to school every day. That's great. You've given us a wonderful list of vignettes and recollections about Doylestown, and I'd like to ask you about some of them now. They won't necessarily be in chronological order, but we'll try to mention the years as we go along. Let's start with a story I was fascinated by. The fire at Henry Mercer's home, Font Hill. I think you mentioned that was about 1914. Tell us about the fire.
Well, one of Jimmy Michener's early recollections is of having been awakened in the middle of the night by his mother to see an enormous fire built on one of the concrete porches of Font Hill. And Dr. Mercer had had his men build it just to prove that the building was fireproof.
What a sight that must have been. Gave Doylestown something to talk about. You mentioned that Henry Mercer was a patient of your father's. Did you know him yourself?
I knew him through his being a patient of my father's, and I felt he was a very learned but introverted man. He was gracious but far from gregarious. And one time, after my father had given him an osteopathic treatment, they were chatting together, and my father noticed that Rollo, one of Dr. Mercer's beloved Chesapeake Retriever dogs, was dragging his hind quarters. And if you are an osteopath and believe in the principles of osteopathy, you feel impelled to try to help any living creature. So my father reached down and treated Rollo's back. And I haven't the faintest idea if it helped the dog in any way. But I do know that Dr. Mercer was so appreciative of my father's love for the dog and wanting to help him that he had his men put in a Mercer fire tile fireplace in our home, and it included the sign of the zodiac of each member of the family.
Now this is the home that's Vista Travel now, the pretty yellow Victorian. Well, that must have been a wonderful surprise to your father. Now, what time period was this? Was when you first moved to Doylestown, or around 1912?
Well,
That time frame?
well, we moved in 1910. I presume it was
Okay.
around that time.
There were a number of pre-World War I recollections that you mentioned. Several groups that started about then, the VIA, the Village Improvement Association. Let's start with that. Let's just go down the list.
That started before the turn of the century, and their primary use for starting it was to provide receptacles to keep the streets clean of litter and trash. And they also had a horse-drawn sprinkling cart which kept the dust down in the streets.
Those early beginnings. And 100 years later, owning and operating a hospital in Doylestown.
In 1975, they opened a 196 bed hospital, to which they're constantly making additions. And it's the only hospital in the world that was built and maintained by a women's organization.
A Federated Women's Club, that's right. What about the Historical Society?
The Historical Society, too, was started before the turn of the century. And it was started in 1985, and Dr. Mercer was a charter member.
1885?
1885.
1885.
Yeah, 1885. Dr. Mercer was a charter member, and the primary use of the Historical Society was to collect implements and instruments that had been used from as far back in time as they could find them. And the Elkins family were kind enough to build a beautiful colonial brick building to house these things. But it soon became inadequate, and Dr. Mercer built a big concrete structure like Font Hill and added to it twice before 1916 to make room for all the implements and tools. And people really heard of Doylestown from all over the world because of this collection of tools.
Mm-hmm. Which is now the Mercer Museum.
Yes.
Right. How about the Nature Club?
The Nature Club was started in 1907 to nurture and enhance the love of nature. And it has done that for all these years. It's still a very active, thriving, growing little club.
You mentioned that Dr. Mercer permitted the use of his grounds for the Nature Club?
Yes, there was a little stone house on it, and they could use it for any of their functions.
Many people will remember Howard Barnes. He was a well-known attorney and banker in Doylestown. You mentioned in your notes Howard Barnes Productions. Tell us about that.
He put on an amateur show every year in Lenape Hall. And one year that I vividly remember, he used the theme magazine covers. And he had each scene represent a picture on the magazine. And in one he had an exquisite young girl in her late teens, Marjorie Barbier, resting on a sliver of moon. And she was draped in yards of beautifully flowing and gracefully draped chiffon.
Must have been quite a picture.
It was.
On a sadder note, but still a very interesting story, the fire of 1913.
Well, the fire of 1913 destroyed the whole southern side of Ashland Street from Main to Clinton, and that included the Barrett Hardware Store, the Lewis Agriculture Company, and the Rhodes Livery Stable. And our fire company had been founded in 1902, but had not kept up with the progress of equipment. And fire companies came from as far as Abington and Glenside, but the fire was so far advanced that they couldn't control it until it had destroyed that block.
Did a lot of people get out of bed that night and come out to?
I think everybody in Doylestown was there. I was only 12 years old, and I remember getting up and going and watching it and seeing everybody you knew there.
So much devastation. Then you told me there was some fundraising to get some new equipment in a hurry, and it came in very handy.
It was the only silver lining to that cloud when the fire company wanted to raise money for updating their equipment. The money just poured in like water, and they were able to get all new equipment and have it completely modern to prevent a serious fire that started in the Fountain House livery stable, and that would have destroyed the whole center of town.
And that was in 1915?
1915.
So as luck would have it, they had the new equipment and all was saved. What about the trolleys in Doylestown and public transportation? What do you remember about the trolleys?
Well, there was a trolley waiting room back of the courthouse on Main Street, and it serviced both the eastern trolleys and the trolleys to Willow Grove. And it was a big, big event in our lives to go to Willow Grove. And it took 3 5-cent fares to get to Willow Grove. And if you wanted to go on to the center of the city, you could change trolley cars, and for 2 more 5-cent fares, go down to center Philadelphia.
Now tell me more about the stops in Willow Grove. Willow Grove Park was there then, and you would go there?
Willow Grove Park was there, and they had what they called attractions, which were roller coaster rides, and one of Jimmy Michener's earlier books was called Fires of Spring, and he told in that about the high school boys who took care of the ticket booths. And
did you see any really memorable attractions or entertainment when you were there?
Well, at night they had a fountain that sprayed water high into the air. Colored lights were played on it, and we thought they were beautiful, but they may have been garish. And then the main attraction was the open-air theater, to which John Philip Sousa and his band came regularly. And that is something you will never, never forget, having seen and heard that band many times.
You also mentioned the flu epidemic during World War I and the devastating effect it had on the population. Tell me some memories about that.
My husband was going to Carnegie Tech at the time, and he belonged to ROTC. And in the barrack in which he was put with the influenza. Out of 300, less than 2 dozen came out alive. And the same condition prevailed over all of the country, and people died faster than they could be buried. And crude, handmade coffins were piled in practically every area of the town, and it was a terrifying time through which to live.
You mentioned that you graduated from high school in 1919, a year after Margaret Mead graduated, and I guess a few years before Jimmy Michener graduated. He was a little bit younger than you.
He was 5 years younger.
Tell me a little bit about Margaret Mead. What are your recollections of her?
Well, her family lived in Hollycombe at the time, and she and her brother Dick were brought into Doylestown each morning, and Margaret was left at the corner of Pine and State and walked to school with Marjorie Barbier, the girl who was on the magazine cover.
Mm-hmm.
And the last year Margaret and Dick went to school, they rented a shoemaker property, not a physical shoemaker, but a woman named Shoemaker who lived on West Court Street, and went to school from there. And Margaret had a party every Saturday night, and we really did not enjoy them. But at that age, you had to have a party to go to Saturday night. So we went, and Margaret's superior knowledge took over, and she bossed everything we did and every word we said, and if possible, every thought we had. One of the teachers at school was George Cressman, and he was invited to speak in the vicinity of Hollycombe. So he was invited to Mead's to dinner, and his brother was a seminarian. He was Luther Cressman, and so he was included in the invitation.
He was visiting his brother? Luther was visiting his brother? And
he was visiting George, and Luther and Margaret had an immediate rapport, and after several meetings became secretly engaged. And he was the first of her 3 marriages. The last was to a man named Gregory Bateson. They had 1 child, Mary Catherine Bateson, and she followed in the footsteps of her parents and became an anthropologist. And I kept quite closely in touch with Margaret. She gave me copies of some of her books. One was called Blackberry Winter, and it told the story of her growing up years. And she also gave me a copy of the first book that her daughter, Catherine Bateson, wrote on anthropology. And as I said, I kept in quite close touch with her, and she was invited to lunch at our house, where I had gotten as many of the people as were still in the area together.
was this in the 50s or 60s?
It was 1976.
Okay.
And we were waiting for Margaret to arrive from New York when her secretary called that she had been taken to the hospital with what proved to be her terminal illness. Mm-hmm. And that was in 1976.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to mention here that the house that she and her family rented was 255 West Court Street, and the Doylestown Historical Society is going to have a highway marker placed at that location at a ceremony in June.
Oh.
What about Jimmy Michener? Do you remember much about him?
Oh, I remember a great deal about him, but I think Lester Chalk and Herman Silverman have taped all that is important about his life.
He was very close to your brother, Edgar?
He was 5 years younger than I, and in my brother Edgar's class at school. And they were very, very close friends. And frequently in an article, Jim will mention Eggs Hammond, which was my brother Edgar.
Let's go on to the period after World War I. In your opinion, what were the social attitudes in Doylestown back then?
Well, there were definite stratas of the elite and the less than elite, and Lee Mitchell Hodges, who had been a neighbor of ours, made a list of 12 of what he felt were the most distinguished families in Doylestown to compare with the Philadelphia 400. He wrote a column for the Evening Bulletin under the heading The Optimist.
What about your friendship with the Swartzlanders?
Well, people looked down and scorned an osteopath at that time. Many did.
Which was your father?
But my father was an osteopath. But Dr. Frank was not quite so narrow-minded as a doctor who lived across the street from him, who wouldn't even buy from a salesman if they sold to my father. But the Swartzlanders were my closest friends. And I happened to be there the afternoon Dr. Frank came home from having delivered stillborn twins to Mrs. William Mercer. And I have never before nor since witnessed such devastation. Dr. Frank paced the hall, giving himself unearned blame for what had happened. But I think he carried that grief to an early grave. A grateful patient gave him a trip abroad for a much-needed rest, and while he was there, he was dancing with a partner whom he had delivered in Doylestown years before. And while dancing, he was stricken with a heart attack and died on the dance floor. It was just an unacceptable grief and shock to his family and friends. But I honestly felt that if Dr. Frank had had his choice, he would have chosen that dramatic death.
There have been some wonderful public gifts that Doylestown has benefited from over the years. What can you tell us about the Opie James Memorial Ambulance?
Well, the Miss Sarah James and Dr. George Loa gave the town the first ambulance it had ever had. And they updated it 10 years later, and then in 1937 gave a completely equipped modern ambulance, a Packard, to the town. And that was one of the early gifts to the town.
What about the Blanche Burpee Playground?
The Blanche Burpee playground was given by the Burpee family, and it included a large acreage at the foot of Oakland Avenue and Church Street. And older children were taught under supervision to play tennis and baseball and basketball, and younger children were supervised in the sandbox and foot-propelled merry-go-rounds and swings and seesaws. And there was an enclosed building on the property where they could be read to if the weather were bad.
Mm-hmm. The Fanny Chapman Pool?
The Fanny Chapman Pool was given by the William Mercers in 1926, and it was near the Borough Dam and was a source of great pleasure to young and old alike. We all enjoyed that pool.
Oh, that's wonderful. What about the Melinda Cox Free Library, which I believe was started in 1914?
That was in 1914. Mr. Cox donated part of his home and all of the books for the library, and it was to be called the Melinda Cox Library in memory of his wife, and he would pay for everything except the salary of a librarian. And in my day, Miss Lucy Price was a librarian, and I kept her pretty busy getting out books. And it moved from State Street to Broad and Court in the building of the old Doylestown Trust Company, and Alice and Martha Edgar were the librarians there. Then it moved to the old Hellier store at the corner of Schull Avenue and Main Street. Mm-hmm. And Margaret Triplett was the head librarian, and it was she that started the book and author luncheons that are still so popular. Mm-hmm. And when the new library was open, adjacent to the Michener Museum and across the street from the Historical Society, the adults and children all got out their old express wagons and formed a parade of express wagons going down Main Street filled with books for the new library.
William Mercer, where does he fit into the Mercer family, and what do you remember of him?
He was a brother to Henry, but they were never very close. And he built the beautiful mansion, Albee, which was almost across from our remodeled barn. And
that's now the Heritage Conservancy, that beautiful brick mansion.
It is now the Heritage Conservancy, and there just couldn't be enough good said about the work that organization does.
You told me that William Mercer had bricklayers come over from Europe.
He did. He had bricklayers come over to teach our bricklayers how the bricks should be laid. And each Christmas season, he and Mrs. Mercer had a big, big party. There were possibly 200 there, and because we were close neighbors, we were always included. And there was entertainment, and then a wonderful supper was served. And it was there that I first heard the Trap Singers. They came in their own bus, and were not so famous in those days.
The Von Trapp family of the Sound of Music.
That's right.
From Austria. Wow. Now, tell me confidentially, I won't tell a soul, were there any scandals in Doylestown?
Well, there were two that I remember. One was when Margaret Sharrett, a registered nurse, rented Chestnut Grove and was said to have been using it as an abortion clinic. And she was taken to court for it at least 3 times by men who did not want their children aborted, and she was never proven guilty.
Now, this wasn't 5 or 10 years ago. This was the 1930s?
I would think.
And that she rented a home on that end of town near where the Y is now. Any other scandals?
Well, when James Sr. disappeared from Doylestown at the same time as did a great deal of money. And he had collected that money from very poor people who thought they were paying off their mortgage. But the money never reached the savings and loan. Neither the money nor Win James were ever seen in Doylestown again.
One story you told me involved a woman who was engaged to Hiram Keller.
That was, let's see,
Charlotte Northrup?
Charlotte Northrup. And she married, well, she was engaged to Hiram Keller, who later became the president judge of Bucks County. And during her engagement, she eloped with Webster Opie, who was also an attorney and known as Mike Opie.
And she ran off with him. And Hiram Keller, Judge Keller, never married, I understand.
No, he never married.
You also mentioned a teacher's institute at the courthouse. Tell me about that.
That was a wonderful experience for all of us. There was an institute that lasted a week, and it was held in the courthouse, and the teachers had to go, but the public was very welcome, and we had the opportunity of hearing wonderful speakers that we would not otherwise have heard. And the most outstanding to me and heartwarming is having heard Helen Keller.
And that was, what, in the 1920s?
I think it was before that, wasn't it? I don't know.
The early part of the century for sure.
Yeah.
Doylestown was incorporated in 1838, and there was a big centennial celebration, I understand, in 1938. You must have participated in that in some way.
I think everybody in Doylestown participated in that. It had a gala week, and it opened with church services on Sunday. Then every day there was something unusual and wonderful, parades or pageants or plays. There was a reception at Burpee's Gardens. There was a reception in the historical building, and there was an assembly ball Friday night and a Mardi Gras Saturday night, and everybody was included. But the thing of which we are most proud is that our mother, Emily Dorothy Hayman, wrote the anthem for the centennial.
Right after World War II, there was a farm that was developed into a neighborhood by the name of Maplewood.
Yes, Bob Lippincott developed the farm that had belonged to Charles Radcliffe, and it was called Maplewood. And the streets were laid out beautifully, and each street was named for a boy who had been killed in either the First or Second World War.
A boy from Doylestown? Boys from town? Also, by the late 1950s, the population in Doylestown had really grown, and a decision was made to build a new courthouse. And I understand that was a pretty controversial issue.
It was a very controversial issue. The lawyers wanted it near their offices, and the people at adored the old courthouse building. It may not have been an architecturally magnificent building, but it was their pride and joy. And they would like the new courthouse to have been where the fairgrounds were. It would have given them room for expansion and for parking. And I think it has been proven that that would have been more practical. However, the lawyers prevailed, and it was built on the old courthouse grounds. And the courthouse was torn down. A fence was put up to protect the onlookers from any accidents. And the words in graffiti that were on that fence, I think, expressed everybody's feelings about it. It said, "The atrocities committed in the name of progress."
I understand that didn't Howard Barnes salvage some part of that at the law library, possibly, that he purchased?
Howard Barnes moved the beautiful little law offices of the Ross brothers, and he had it put on his property at Court and Garden Alley.
Okay. You also mentioned many businesses that were in Doylestown. Some are still around.
Well, one that is still around and functioning actively is Kenny's Newsstand, right near Main and West State Street. And they are so kind and obliging. If you go in there and want something they don't have in stock, if it's along the lines of their work, they will try to get it for you. They sold newspapers, magazines, and books, along with others few items. And Joe Kenny was very popular, and he was wanted constantly as MCs for any functions in town. He had such a marvelous sense of humor, and his wife helped him run the newsstand. But after their death, it is now being run in the same efficient, kind, warm-hearted way by their daughter, Barbara, who is, her name's Donna.
Dommel, Barbara Dommel.
Dommel.
Dorothy, this is going back again, but there are a couple of other businesses we should talk about. You told me, I think around 1912, a wonderful story about walking into town to get ice cream. Not, you couldn't get it in the grocery store, I guess, in a frozen container. Tell us about that.
Oh, you had to take a bowl and go to the shop where they made ice cream. And we were about 2 blocks from that shop. And
that was Prater's Bakery? Prater's?
Piter's.
Piter's Bakery,
Piter's.
right where Hornberger's is now, you told me.
Yes, yes. And you took your bowl there, and they filled it with as much ice cream as you needed or as much as you could afford. Money happened to be in very short supply at our house at that time. And one day I took the bowl out there and got the ice cream. And on the way home, the cold of the bowl must have cracked and broken the dish, and it fell to the floor, and I was left holding a little piece of the bowl, and all of our wonderful anticipated dessert was melting on the sidewalk. It really was a catastrophe.
Oh, did you get in any trouble?
No, the family never blamed me for it, but I blame myself plenty.
What about Climbers store?
Climbers was known all over the vicinity, I think. It had 3 different locations. It started before the turn of the century, and its last location was where the county linen is now doing a wonderful business. And Mr. Clymer had this great big store that included everything, and the thing that he said about his furniture department, his guarantee was that they stood behind every bed they sold. And Lee Mitchell Hodges, about whom I've told you, wrote a poem for his column. And it was a long, long poem about Clymer's store. But the last few lines sum up all of Bob Clymer's functions. And they said, "Darn my bones, I do believe, if some fine morn with fig leaves meet, Adam should come walking in with Eve, Bob's men could fix them up with complete, with everything you need except a coffin." And that's the thing you don't need often.
That's wonderful. Lived in Doylestown for most of the century, some 86 years. Looking back with all the changes you've seen and experienced, what stands out most in your mind about the changes in Doylestown?
Well, 2 important things are radio and television, which I have not mentioned. And it seems to me they've taken over some lives, but they have a great many important functions. One is bringing us the news, and another that is very hard for me to understand is that you can sit in your own home and see a function or happening or newsworthy event that's going on in a distant part of the world, and you see it while it's happening. That seems incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Then 2 other things are the computers and the fax machines. The computers have probably eliminated a lot of jobs, as well as having created a lot of jobs. And they are a very, very important part of our present life. Now, I want to say, is this the end? That I'm at this time looking forward to telling you all about my next 100 years.
Thank you, Dorothy. On behalf of the Doylestown Historical Society, this has been Doylestown since the early 1900s by Dorothy Hayman Redfield, as interviewed by Victoria Azar. Thank you.